Hey, welcome back to another Story Hacker podcast. I'm your host. My name is Nick. Today we are getting into the Goldilocks Effect, flow, and how to position yourself to win at the game of life.
You're listening to the Story Hacker podcast. Here's your host.
What's good, Story Hacker fam? Narrative psychology is what we're talking about today here at the Story Hacker podcast. We believe that better stories lead to brighter futures. And the way that happens is through our look at taking a look at script writing, taking a look at marketing and narrative psychology so that we can live a better life. I am Nick. I am your host. And the story premise is what we're talking about today. 3 specific things I really want you to focus in on: flow state, Goldilocks rule, and the unfair advantage. And so let's hop into it. If you've been listening since 2016, I want to say thank you. If you're new to the Story Hacker podcast, I would invite you to go back and check out some of the past episodes just to get a feel for where we're at, kind of restarting and starting from square one, because, sometimes after a couple of years, you just got to get back to it. And so this is the story premise. And I want to define for us narrative psychology. The way that I've, talked about narrative psychology has been the story we tell ourselves about ourselves and the world around us. And narrative psychology is the study of how human beings construct stories to deal with our experiences. And narrative inherently has this method of meaning. Whenever we talk about narrative, there is something behind it. There is a meaning behind it. Theodore R. Sarbin became the pioneer of narrative psychology in 1985. His previous work was leading him around this idea of roles in society. And so if you have roles, those are characters. They're playing out in a, story. So he came up with narrative psychology. And like I said, here at the Story Hacker podcast, we call this telling the story about ourselves and the world around us. That's narrative psychology. That's our internal narrative. That's our story. Another great psychologist, Dan P. Adams, has this great quote, and it says, "Self and culture come together in narrative. What's happening outside in the world, what's happening with you, and how you see the world collides in a story." And so some psychologists don't agree with narrative psychology and have named a couple of psychological biases. Specifically, the one I'm thinking of is called narrative fallacy. And narrative fallacy is where you fall into everything as a story, like the ketchup bottle on the, in the grocery store. Like, you have to choose the perfect one because that's going to set you on the right trajectory for X, Y, and for Z, which is not true. It's definitely not true. And when everything is a story and we go out of our way to make everything fit narrative, we can be doing ourselves a disservice. But we still need to take a look at, at our internal narrative. And so I believe that narrative psychology is just as helpful as it is dangerous. There's been this psychological phenomenon I'll highlight for you real quick. It's called Jerusalem syndrome. Have you heard of this? And it's when somebody experiences intense religious psychosis claiming to be like a religious figure when they're in Jerusalem, when they're in Israel. And it's fascinating. I remember going to Israel in 2019, and part of them talking to us about going there is like, some people have experienced what this is, Jerusalem syndrome, where people believe that they're Moses and they're going to lead Israel out of, Egypt, and, just the stories. And this happens to different people. It's not just Christians or Muslims or Jews. It's been agnostics and atheists who have experienced this, psychological phenomenon. And I'll say this: when reality and internal narrative don't align, that can cause a great deal of tension and discrepancy, just like Jerusalem syndrome found when they remove people from the area, a few weeks later, they come back to normal. It's just really, really interesting. But I do believe that we have to align and we have to be ready for some tension when it comes to the story we tell ourselves about ourselves and the story that we want to live. See, stories are powerful ways of generating meaning, and it's how we make sense of the world around us, and it's how we determine course in our life. And if we're not living in alignment with where we want to go, we're living in this discrepancy, and it could be just as dangerous as Jerusalem syndrome. It could be just as dangerous as, some psychosis. And in today's podcast, I want to take a look at why narrative psychology needs more study, attention, and some somatic integration, and how narrative psychology can help with cutting through our psychological biases, reprogramming our brain body towards habits that benefit us, And as we adopt a different story and new paradigms, how we can shift our behaviors towards our own favor. And so that brings me to flow state, Goldilocks rule, and unfair advantage. What I want to say is I've been reading Atomic Habits by James Clear. Again, I love this book. I've recommended it so much on my TikTok. And if you go visit my TikTok, it's all about books. But the reason I tell you that is because I do believe that us reading books, as you and I read books, what it does is one gives us language that we might not have had. Specifically in the area of like self-help and psychology, I think that's huge because you can't run these experiments, you can't do these tests. Maybe you can. Maybe you're somebody who is in the field. But for a large portion of us, we cannot run these tests. We can't do this. And so as we really think around what it's going to take to change our narrative, books are really helpful. They give us language, they give us perspective, they can elicit emotions that we didn't even know that we had. It can show us complexities, it can show us different perspectives around the world. And so that's why I default to books, because it can give us the language. And language, if you know, vocabulary is the starting ground of change. It's the seedbed of where the garden of narrative can grow from. And the reason that I tell you this is because I think only 1% of Americans are currently reading anything. And I think as high as something like, I think it's like 97% of Americans haven't read a book since high school or since college, and which is mind-blowing. And so I will say that I am an avid reader. I love to read because it does give me new language, new experiences, new thoughts, new ideas. And so that is really, really important. So when we talk about Atomic Habits and James Clear, we're talking about flow state, Goldilocks rule, and an unfair advantage. And so let's talk about some of these things. You are predisposed to certain moods, certain habits, and personality traits that are rooted in your family tree because you are made up of the genetic material from your parents. And the reason why some people, some addiction recovery programs and participants focus on things like a genogram is because it is very, very helpful to take a look at genealogy and the story of your family tree. And in a genogram essentially is that. It's like you draw a tree and then you see your grandparents and their grandparents and, just on and on. And so you can start to see that maybe some of the habits of your parents actually came from your grandparents, and your great-grandparents went through this trauma of, maybe they were the first to migrate to the United States and their immigration process was, it was really heavy, or they were constantly talked about by neighbors. And so that made them hypervigilant to instill in their children that they need to, disassociate more from the cultural identity and adopt more identity. Or maybe it made them hold on stronger to that identity because they felt threatened. And you start to see as, you work on a genogram that your grandparents' struggle can actually be handed down to you. Maybe their addiction or, some of their mental states. It can be eye-opening to know that you're genetically predisposed to some of these whether it be addictions or whether it be, habits, traits, moods. And what I find fascinating is there has been studies around the children of Vietnam veterans. Children of Vietnam veterans had just as much PTSD as their parents. And so non-combated, kids who have never been in combat actually had just as high levels of PTSD because it is, one, it's an environmental thing, but two, it can also be passed down genetically. And so I want to dive a little bit deeper in this idea of this genetic transfer, because what can happen is the way that our bodies encode trauma. Your body keeps a score, and it absolutely does. You can have tension in your back and your shoulders, in all parts of your body, because your muscles will encode, wounds. It'll encode traumas, and whenever it starts to feel those things could be popping up again, it will actually start to have a feeling, and you could have feelings in your stomach, in your back. And what this is doing, and the reason that this is tied to genogram is because if you were to talk to your parents or your grandparents, they'll be like, yes, I carry my tension in my neck or my hips, or I get an upset stomach. And you're going to find that it's genetic, that it is related to your parents. And so the more and more that you can be open and talk with your parents and your grandparents about the struggles that you have, the way that you feel in your brain and in your body, it's going to start to highlight a couple of things. Is one, that you have a lot more control than you think you do. Two, your predisposition doesn't mean you're automatically going to have those moods, have to have those habits, and have to have those personality traits. You can actually start to do work and to make adjustments to move away from them. And so somatic integration is something that I am highly involved in, and it's where you take time to really study your nervous system. And I believe as we start to invest in our central nervous system, as we start to invest in our brain body, that somatic integration, the integration of the brain body to where we can feel those feelings of nervousness and process through them fairly quickly, almost instantaneously, and then start to realize that was just a signal. And as long as I acknowledge that signal, as long as I do something with that signal, I'm going to be fine. And so, yeah, I think that's really, really, really important. As we talk about this, we're going to get into some of those somatic practices. But in Atomic Habits, James Clear talks about getting the most out of your genes. And so this is paradigm shifting stuff. And it kind of goes like this. How do you find your game? How do you find the job? How do you level yourself up in life based upon your own predisposed genetics? And as your genetics play a role in your habits, there's something that I think is really important. On page 220, James Clear talks about these 5 traits, and I think these 5 traits are something that you should definitely think through. Go pick up this book. There is a link in the description that you can go pick up this book or any of the other books that I mentioned. I have a reading list there for you. But your personality, this is what makes you up. These are the big 5, I would say. And the one is openness to experience. And this is kind of playing that spectrum of curious and inventive on one end and conscious and consistent on the other. Are you somebody who wants to explore and wants to try new things, or are you super cautious and you want your habits to be the same? You want your routine to be the same. The second is conscientiousness. Are you organized and efficient, or easygoing and spontaneous? Next is extroversion, outgoing and energetic, or solitary and reserved. We know this is introverts, extroverts. Fourth is agreeableness, friendly, compassionate, or challenging and detached. And neuroticism, anxious and sensitive, to confident, calm, and stable. And so what you can see is that these 5 personality traits are a scale, a continuum, and those make up who you are. This is really important because when it comes to finding a job, when it comes to finding your skill at life, the thing that levels you up, the thing that makes you happy, this is different for everybody. And I'd say it like this: you are made up of a universe, and to give you a map of going from A to B is a disservice because your traits are different. You're going to find out your life experiences are different. Giving somebody a roadmap and saying this is how you get better, it normally doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because we are all so different. And so that means that we have to create the roadmap from ourselves. And what I love about James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, is he's helping us uncover those little habits that are going to help us move forward. But there's also 4 questions about work that I would love to ask you that he poses. And I think that having these 2, things back to back, the 5 traits of who you are, kind of discovering your personality traits, and then your 4 questions about work is going to help you with this thing called flow state. And so what feels like fun to me, but work to others? And so what this means is that because it feels like fun to you, you're going to show up and you're going to do it over and over and over again. And so whether that's, deep sea fishing, like you love to go out on the water and it just feels like an adventure every time to you, while other people are like, hey bro, I'd rather have a desk job. That is definitely not me. Or maybe you're the kind of person who loves editing video and you love it so much that it's like, man, I wish I could do more of this. While other people who are in the video editing space are just like, you know what, this sucks and I hate it. And so what that does is it starts to give you this idea of what is an unfair advantage. What makes you lose track of time? This is something we call flow state. And the reason that we look at flow state in narrative psychology, the reason that we look at flow state and habits and change is because flow state is going to give you a great indicator of kind of what you're good at and also what you can do that's fun, that is going to keep you preoccupied, but also on the verge of what we call the Goldilocks effect. So Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he's the father of flow. And it's really when you're in the zone, when you forget about time, when you forget about food, when you forget about how your body actually feels, you are so in the moment and you're so in your flow state that time passes by and you're like, man, I can't believe that, 8 hours has just gone by. This has been so fun and invigorating. And you come out on the other side of your flow state feeling more like yourself. You feel energized instead of after an 8 hours of doing something you don't like or love, you feel depleted. And so that's really, really important. Another question for you is, where do I get greater returns than the average person? Where do you put a little bit of work and you just see, man, your work is so much better than everybody else in the space? And I think that's really, really important because it also goes back to that idea of your skill set. It goes back to if you're getting better ROI than some of your competitors or some of the people in the same space, what it is telling you is that you're doing something right and you're doing something well. And finally, what comes natural to me? I think asking this question, what feels natural? And I think this is really important. Feeling alive, feeling natural, feeling like the real you, imitating yourself is a concept, a psychological concept of, I feel more like me when I do these things. And so that's what it means when things come natural to you. And so it's a place where there's no second guessing, there's no self-criticism. It's just like authentic, it's genuine, you're going with emotion. It's a bit of that, also that flow state. And so I find this really, really key because you want to apply this to your life. Your work is a story about what you value, and your self-talk is a story about how you see yourself in your work. And so going through those 5 traits is really, really important. One of the things that I like is personality tests. And the reason I like personality tests is because, like Myers-Briggs is going to help you a bit with that. Some of the Enneagram can help you with some of this. DISC is another one. Strength Finders is another one. And what this does is it starts to compile your makeup, your unique skill set, you as who you are based upon these 5 questions. So I would say go check those out. Those are phenomenal. For me, when I started to do Strength Finder, I realized that it was future, it was belief, it was command. In my top 5, or those being top 3, future, belief, and command, really helped me understand that I can lead with forward-thinking vision, and people are going to listen to some of the concepts and the executions that I'm going to set forth. And so that's really, really important. So future, belief, command, individualization is another key strength that I have, is that I understand what it is to be an individual, and a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work for me, and I know it doesn't work for my team. And so that's why I have individual growth plans for my team and individual ways of working with people. Does it get exhausting? Yeah, it can definitely get exhausting. But the ROI, it is definitely more effective. It is not efficient, but I go for effectiveness. And so that's one of the other things. And the final thing is input is, I like it when people give input. I also understand when people give input, they feel valued. And so those 5 things create this really unique leadership ability that I have. But all that to say is, when you take your Strength Finder, you're going to find that you are made up in a completely different way, and you're going to have a different way of leading or doing things. And so that's really, really, really important. And then self-talk is really, really huge, because one thing that I feel about the flow state, and the reason that I love flow state so much, is because that's when the self-talk stops. And so if you've gone through like complex PTSD, and just a quick pause right here, this podcast has always been about education and entertainment. This is not a diagnosis. This is not psychological. I am not a doctor. So please, 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 if you are experiencing anything that needs a medical professional, this podcast is not here to help heal you of complex post-traumatic stress disorders or anything like that nature. What we are here to do is just talk about the way that the internal narrative works, and to have fun with our stories. And so please hear me as I make that caveat. I don't always make that caveat, but I do find it necessary to make that caveat, because my communication might seem like I know what I'm talking about, This is for entertainment and education purposes only. This is not medical advice. And so, yeah, when it comes to complex CPTSD, one of the things that can happen is it's hard to get into flow state. We can sometimes feel like we are not worthy to pursue the things that we want to pursue because there's, a bit of complex post-traumatic stress that is still lingering. And that somatic integration is so important. And so finding your self-talk can really be difficult because it could be buried under layers of, oh, I'm not good enough, or I probably am really narcissistic. I need to start thinking about others. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do as individuals is we can breathe. And I know that sounds really, really simple, but there are things that comes from our breath that is just so, so good. Deep breaths like, holding, like the 4-6-8 method, where you inhale for 4, hold for 6, exhale for 8, can calm you down and start to, do some of that physical work of where the brain-body integration happens. Another one is the 8-8-8 method. You breathe in for 8, hold for 8, out for 8. There's really no wrong way to breathe. And so, yeah, the other thing that I highly suggest is meditation because it is breath work focused on clearing the mind. And so what you can see is if you have a lot of chatter, if you have a lot of distraction, if you have a lot of negative self-talk, what you're going to be able to do is calm that down. And then once you go through that, it's a lot easier to get into flow states. You don't feel as guilty if you have CPTSD or if you're anxious. It actually helps align the brain body in such a way that moving forward with getting into flow state is actually a preferred method. Also does this really interesting thing where over time, if you meditate, shrinks the amygdala and it activates the prefrontal cortex. So you feel a little bit more a bias towards action than a bias towards rumination. So I love that about meditation and highly suggest. The other thing too is you can still get those same benefits from high intensity workouts because what happens is if your brain is on overdrive, if your central nervous system is just on fire and you're constantly scared and anxious and worried and adding caffeine to keep you going, one of the nice things about high intensity workouts like long runs or, just the, things like CrossFit or HIIT workouts, what they do is they start to drain you in a good way. Like you start to get tired and then your brain's barriers and defenses go down. And sometimes you've seen people have some somatic integrations, like after long runs, a 6-mile run, people are just so emotional and so like start to cry. And the reason is because you're now allowing your brain and your body to feel. And it takes a lot to sometimes drop those guards that your brain is putting up, the negative self-talk. And then you start to see that life is beautiful. And through these journaling methods and workouts and breathing and meditation, what tends to happen is you start to see that life is actually really, really good. And even the parts of life that aren't really, really good, you start to see in a way where the amygdala is not driving the center of your brain. That is where fear, fight, flight, fawn, freeze, all of those things, they start to slowly, gradually go away. And so what I want to tell you is the journey of finding your flow state, the journey of finding that Goldilocks effect. And I think that's probably one thing we should just focus on real quick is the Goldilocks effect is where flow state can happen, where it is, you're kind of in between systems 1 thinking and systems 2 thinking. And those two things are system 1 being like automatic, system 2 being like having to think. And so what happens is you straddle that line where both of those modes of thinking are engaged. You have the Goldilocks effect to where you are just outside of your comfort zone and trying to accomplish something, but you're still moving towards it. And just being that far outside of that comfort zone, just a little bit, it's obtainable and you start to reach for it, whether that's in your work or in some of your habits or some of your, extracurricular things that you're doing. I think that's really, really important to highlight. That is what the Goldilocks rule is. When it's between systems 1 thinking and systems 2 thinking are both engaged, and you're also in the flow state, which brings you to this big idea of this is your unfair advantage. if you can calm your body, if you can get the brain body somatic integration going, if you can chill to the point to where you can start to work on the things that you love to work on without feeling guilty about it, what's going to happen is you're going to start to develop an unfair advantage. You're going to start to see the world in a whole new way, and you start to pursue the things that you love instead of pursuing things that you think are necessities. And what this does is brings a bit of joy, a bit of flow to your life. And the more flow that you have in your life, I believe the better things are going to go. And so my challenge to you is go take some of those personality tests that I mentioned. If you don't know who you are, you need to understand the traits that make you up. And then the questions about work. What is getting you into the flow state? If you want to check out Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, that is a great starting point. It is a great, great book when it comes to understanding what flow is. So yeah, take that time to go and find some of those personality tests and also pick up that book. Either Atomic Habits is great. Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is another great book around the flow state. A final thing for you, if you want to dive deep into changing your internal narrative, I've created something for you called Story Mode 90. It is at storybetter.co. All you need to do is just put in your email and you will get it's 90 days. It's a checklist. It's a journal that can go all the way through, books to read, workouts to participate in, diets to follow, and just some journaling prompts that are going to help you get to a better version of yourself. It is based upon that idea of 75 hard, but instead of it being 75 days, it's 90. And instead of it being hard, it is a story mode. It is more for your internal narrative than it is for you to get jacked and to get ripped. So much so, I feel like, even if you feel like you're the nerdiest of nerds and are a keyboard warrior, but don't ever spend time in the gym, this is going to be something that you will enjoy tremendously, because it is not about how hard you work out. It is literally about getting this brain-body somatic integration going through the entirety of your life. So go check it out, storybetter.co. And as always, if you've enjoyed this podcast, let me know by dropping me a line anywhere on any of the social medias at Nick_Ovaya. And until we chat again, I hope you tell the world a great story. Peace.